Good morning, everyone. Welcome, Mr. O'Toole.
Morning.
So I understand it's Maître Rodriguez this morning.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole.
Good morning.
We can have the witness sworn, please.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. May I please have your full name for the record and spell your last name, please?
Erin Michael O'Toole, O''T''OOLE.
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning again, Mr. O'Toole. As you know, I'm Natalia Rodriguez, Commission Counsel, and we're going to start with some preliminary matters. On February 23rd, 2024, you had an interview with Commission Counsel and a follow-up interview on March 1st, 2024. Is that right?
That's correct.
And an interview summary was generated from those interviews. Is that right?
Correct.
Mr. Rodriguez, can you just speak a bit louder?
Oh,
please?
sure.
Or closer to the mic?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, just checking. Okay, so I will call up the witness summary at WIT24.en. And Mr. O'Toole, what you're seeing there is the interview summary that was generated from your interviews with Commission Counsel. Is that right?
Yes,
And you've reviewed the summary for accuracy?
I have.
And do you have any corrections, additions, or deletions to make at this time?
I do not.
And do you adopt the contents of this witness summary as part of your evidence before the Commission today?
Yes, I do.
Great. So we'll have that entered into evidence. And for the record, the French translation of this summary is at WIT24.fr. Now, just to go over a little bit of your background, I understand you were a Conservative Member of Parliament for Durham from 2012 to 2023. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you served as party leader and leader of the official opposition from 2020 to 2022. Is that right?
Yes,
And under Prime Minister Harper, you were Minister of Veterans Affairs.
I was.
And you were named Foreign Affairs Critic in the Conservative Shadow Cabinet of Party Leader Andrew Scheer.
I was, yes.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background before politics and how that may have shaped your views as a politician?
Well, my time in the military shaped my views on national security, on foreign affairs, defense, these issues. As far back as the early 90s, we were looking at the NATO and NORAD alliances that Canada had, but also potential flashpoints in the future, including the Taiwan Strait. Things like this I was learning about as a young officer cadet at the Royal Military College. And so security issues and the need to be prudent and serious with respect to influence in these sorts of things were all cultivated during my time as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so that colored my time in politics. I'm a lawyer as well, so that background was also very important to me as an MP on these issues of national security.
Thank you. Now, I understand you received a briefing by CSIS concerning foreign interference on May 26, 2023, in which you received classified information. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now I'm going to take you to a document, can.doc.22. And this is entitled Commission Request for Summary Information on Briefing to to Erin O'Toole, rather. And so you understand that the Commission requested from CSIS an unclassified summary of the briefing that you received in May of 2023.
Yes.
And this is a summary that was generated. Have you had a chance to review this summary?
I have.
And now I would ask that you not disclose any of the classified information you received in this briefing, but in general terms, does this summary accord with the general topics and information that you were provided with in that briefing without getting into specifics, obviously?
It does, in a very general way. It touches on themes. I also, in one of my final speeches in the House of Commons, referenced my briefing in a very careful way that I wasn't revealing any intelligence information or information that would reveal sources to ensure that on the public record we could have some sharing with the public, because I think transparency is important.
Thank you. And again, without giving any details of the content of that briefing, did you find the briefing to be useful in the sense that you were given information that you could put into action or you could do something with in order to better protect yourself from foreign interference?
I would have appreciated the briefing a few years earlier, but yes, it was very helpful in understanding what was happening.
Thank you. So moving now to the 2019 election, I understand that your primary role in that election was one of candidate. Is that right?
Yes, and in Ontario, I did help a range of other candidates as kind of a prominent member of caucus, but I didn't have any national tour responsibilities as I had had in 2015.
Okay, so you weren't part of the national campaign in 2019?
I was not.
Okay. And were you made aware of any concerns in your role as candidate and assisting other candidates, as you said, regarding foreign interference during that election in 2019?
I wasn't aware of any concerns in that election. As I've said in my statement, the leadership that predated the 2019 election, I did see for the first time the influence of platforms like WeChat and the ability to organize cultural communities based on specific social media channels like WeChat.
Okay, thank you. And I'm being advised, just for the sake of the translators, that both of us need to speak a little bit more slowly in order to help them in their work. Thank you. And were you aware of any concerns regarding foreign interference prior to the 2021 election, any time between 2019 and 2021?
Yes, in limited fashion. Certainly the Chinese ambassador made negative comments towards the Conservative opposition and myself. But in terms of seeing any orchestrated foreign interference, that was not really on our radar prior to the election. We had taken pretty strong positions with respect to the Uyghur genocide, with respect to the two Michaels, with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, a range of policies that we thought were not in our national interest, that the Trudeau government was pursuing or supporting. But we didn't see evidence of foreign interference. There was just a sense that the stronger positions with respect to China was probably being tracked closely by China.
And just to take you back to 2019 for a second, were you aware of the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, which we've been calling the Site Task Force, in 2019? And were you aware of who the representative from the Conservative Party would have been to that entity?
I was not aware of who our representative was, and I only knew that a task force to look at the issue was formed. I did not know its structure, nor did we get any briefings or background information on it.
Okay, so you knew of the existence, but nothing more than that. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. So I want to take you now to the 2021 election. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the discourse that was happening in Parliament before it ended for the summer in 2021, some of the issues that dominated the debate that, in your view, may be relevant to the issues that we're dealing with today.
Certainly, I referenced the genocide towards the Uyghur, Muslim, and Turkic populations in China. We had taken a very careful and deliberate approach to bringing the issue and the vote to declare it a genocide. I had waited until I saw evidence through both U.S. sources and UK sources that made me satisfied that we weren't being cavalier with the use of the term genocide. And I think discourse today is far too cavalier with very, very important terms like that. So that drew a lot of attention, both in Canada and internationally. We were the first parliament, the first assembly after the United States to make such a declaration. And we knew that there was negative commentary in China as a result of that. But right before the election was the Winnipeg lab situation, which we had very, very serious concerns with. And quite frankly, the Trudeau government's handling of that entire episode was quite troubling. Yes, senior civil service servant was called to the bar of the House of Commons, something not done in a century. They were taking the Speaker of the House of Commons to court in order to not comply with the Speaker's direction. So very, very concerning right on the eve of the election. So the Winnipeg lab scandal, as we called it at the time, was probably the most pressing issue in the House of Commons before the summer break. And of course, there was not supposed to be an election that summer. Parliament had voted to say that the will of Parliament was that there should be an election only after COVID, the crisis was over. So the Winnipeg lab controversy came just before the election.
Okay, thank you. And I understand some Conservative MPs in Parliament raised issues, concerns related to China-related issues. Can you tell us a bit about what the response was when these issues were raised in Parliament?
Yes, I should add too that the private member's bill from MP Kenny Chiu in terms of a foreign agent registry was also generating some headlines and some debate in the House of Commons. The troubling thing we found was that, and I remember this is the case on several occasions in the House in my questioning of the Prime Minister, is that the specter of any questions on the Winnipeg lab or an issue like that was somehow contributing to anti-Asian discrimination or anti-Asian hate in the pandemic. I thought those responses were unfair at the time. And then in the run-up to the election, those responses inadvertently echoed propaganda from China with respect to any questions about the origin of COVID-19 or any questions about our biological laboratory in Winnipeg were somehow fomenting hate and discrimination. And that was not only wrong and unfair, it set a bad tone heading into the election.
So what effect, if any, do you think that those comments in Parliament may have had? What is the connection that you're making there between those comments and then the subsequent messaging that was being circulated during the election?
Well, certainly anytime, the Prime Minister or ministers of the government use the term racism or discrimination, there's an intention to create chill so that we wouldn't ask questions. And we were being very, very, very careful about how we talked about these issues during a public health emergency, COVID-19. My concern now, particularly in retrospect, is that approach the government was taking complemented indirectly narratives that were being advanced by China and its agents in Canada. And I think in the election, we saw that explode into a campaign of misinformation on social media, but also in-person miscommunication to intimidate voters, to mislead voters with respect to me, with respect to certain candidates, and to our policies in general. And I think it was an accidental connection, but it was something that, looking back, set the tone before the election. And it should have been something looked at a little closer by sight, in my view.
Right, and by sight meaning the site task force.
Yes.
Okay. So turning now to the campaign, I understand that in 2021, you're obviously the leader of the official opposition, and so you're very much involved in the national campaign. And I understand the national campaign was using something called predictive modeling instead of polling data for the projections. Can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of what the difference is between predictive modeling and polling?
The predictive modeling really identifies groups of individuals, groups of Canadians, and then generally, if you really do the data and the research to understand those groups, you can be predictive of their reaction to certain questions or how they might vote or behave on certain issues. We used it very extensively to prepare for the election and to see how to best communicate our policies. The Conservative Party, I wanted to modernize and use the same tools that the Liberal Party under Mr. Trudeau had adopted, and they had followed the lead of what the Obama campaign had done on behavioral predictive modeling. Once you created the model, it was, in my experience, in the run-up to the election and during the election, extremely accurate, and much more accurate than polling, because you saw those behaviors and those attitudes and those voting blocks over time. So we were intensely focused on 4 groups within this model of, I think, 8 or 9 groups, that we felt if we did well enough with those 4 that were open to our message, we could win the election.
So I want to take you now to a document, EOT 4. And if we can scroll down to the second page. Okay, so this is a document that you produced, and if we go to page 3 of that, right, so it says, it's dated August 16, 2021, and it says CPC model. Is this an example of the modeling, the output of what that modeling would have generated?
Yes, in terms of the results aggregate, yes.
Okay, thank you. And who produced this chart or this information that we see here?
It would have been my campaign team, which included Dan Robertson, was one of our leads on creating and working with the modelers. We went to a firm based out of the United Kingdom for this type of specialized work, although now I see it has come to Canada. So Dan Robertson, Justin Bumstead, a number of people that were kind of my model and my numbers people.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that you provided this modeling information to the independent special rapporteur, David Johnston. Is that right?
I did. I wanted to give him some of the context for why on election night we were very startled by a handful of ridings that fell completely outside of the ranges for the model.
Right. And in fact, you did put a package together that included not just this information, but some memoranda as well that had been prepared for you and for the party related to what you say were irregularities in certain ridings. Is that right?
Yes, I gave Mr. Johnston basically the same package that my team had given to the site task force after the election. We were very forthright in sharing what limited information we had, because we didn't go into the campaign thinking that we needed to create an intelligence dossier on what we saw in the field. But as instances of interference were being flagged by the campaigns, my campaign team said, well, let's raise this with the site panel. But near the end, let's try and keep track of some of this information that our organizers are seeing. I wish now that we'd had a much more careful approach and had documented everything, but we shared with the site task force after the election what we did assemble, and I shared all of the information I still had and could share, I shared with Mr. Johnston.
Okay, so we'll go to that now. It's EOT 1_R. If we go to the second page, okay, that's great right there. So this is the briefing package that you prepared for the special rapporteur, and it looks like it was prepared by your office, and it's dated May 17, 2023. Is that right?
Yes, and I gave Mr. Johnson and Ms. Block copies when they arrived, and my deep concern with the special rapporteur was I was giving him this package, and later in the meeting, he told me that his interim report was already in translation. So you could see how I did not feel the special rapporteur took the process seriously when evidentiary package that my office took time to prepare was a supplement to what they had already sent off as a report. I did not respond well to that.
So we'll go to page 4 of this document just to see some of the information that was included in here. So this is a memo. It's dated May 17, 2023. It's prepared by Justin Bunstead, who you referenced earlier. And if we go to page 10, this is another memo. It's to Jim Ross, and it's from Sadiq Valiani. And again, it's a memo, the subject line, foreign interference in our election, and it's dated three days after the election, September 24th, 2021, maybe 4 days. And if we go to page 14, this is the modeling that we saw earlier. And we'll look at this a little bit more closely in a little bit. So we can take that down now. So what was your understanding then, based on the modeling on election day, of where the Conservatives would end up in terms of seats that day?
Yeah, reliving those last few days of the campaign, we went from winning the seat count a week before the election with a small, modest minority to, on election day, losing the seat count and still winning the popular vote. We saw the vote changing largely on the vaccine and the vaccine mandate issue. But on election night, when we knew we were going to lose, my campaign manager had said, our models and how the vote goes, you should end up with about 127, 128 seats, which will be a historic level for opposition. And when you consider it was a pandemic election, we were largely on the wrong side of public opinion on the vaccine mandate issue, which is, in my view, why the Prime Minister called the election. That was being briefed to me to say, calm down, you did okay. You'll be able to live to fight another day and stay on as leader. So I went in that night feeling, okay, we're going to end up with 127, 128 seats. And as returns were coming in that night, not that I asked for any detail, but that night there was already clear indication that a number of ridings were vastly outside of our modeling window, and the ridings were the same ridings that we had been complaining about with respect to foreign interference. We've never connected the two, and even months after, when I spoke about ranges, I always used to say, you know, between 5 and 9, 6 and 9. I would never be precise, but
Sorry, in terms of 5 and 9, in terms of what?
5 to 9 seats that I think were possibly changed as a result of foreign interference. Narrower margin seats where we had large numbers of people not voting and suspicions about voter suppression in those specific seats. Certainly nowhere near enough to change the results of the election, but for people in those seats, if they were undergoing intimidation or suppression measures, their democratic rights were being trampled on by foreign actors. So certainly it was serious, and that's how I formulated that rough view in my mind based on the modeling and from our anecdotal reports from the ground in the campaign about various forms of foreign interference.
And is that your view today, that 6 to 9 ridings were lost due to foreign interference in 2021?
I believe it's in that range, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, you believe that the Conservative Party became a target for the PRC in 2021 in the election. Is that right?
Yes.
And in your view, what made the Conservative Party a target for the PRC?
I believe our policies were more in line with allies like the United States that were starting to take more aggressive trade positions with respect to the export of Chinese steel and aluminum, things like that. Our positions on human rights issues, the Uyghurs in particular, but also Hong Kong and Tibet. Our positions were much stronger, and I believe reflected our values and interests as a country better than the policies of Mr. Trudeau. The Trudeau government was viewed by our allies, and I would hear this regularly from diplomats. We were seen as being offside with respect to a very ambitious agenda with China at a time that particularly the Five Eyes allies were being far more cautious with respect to China. So I think this recognition that had the Conservatives won, and if I was Prime Minister, we would have had a much more wide-eyed view and realistic view from a foreign policy perspective on China. That drove the interest for Beijing. Certainly that status quo, the Liberal government was probably preferable in their view to a change in government to Conservatives, given the vast difference in our policy positions.
And so just to clarify, the Uyghur motion was brought by Mr. Chong, who is a member of the Conservative caucus, and the Foreign Agent Registry was also a Conservative Party member's bill. Is that right?
Yes, the Foreign Agent Registry, which other allies like the United States and Australia use such a registry in a similar way to a lobbying registry, that people have an obligation to register. That was Kenny Chu's private member's bill. Michael Chong was the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, so the issue on recognizing that the Uyghur genocide was under his mandate. And I would add that when I appointed Michael to become the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, at the speech where I unveiled the caucus positions, I talked about how proud I was that someone whose father immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong, Hong Kong having been defended by Canadian soldiers during World War II, it was truly the Canadian story that he could then take strong positions in Canada's interests and come from a diaspora community of China. I think that shows our country at its best, and Michael continues to do a great job.
The 2021 CBC platform, the Conservative Party platform for 2021, did include numerous references to China. You accept that, right?
Yes.
And it did take quite a hard stance against China. It could be argued, some would say.
I wouldn't say against anything. It was an expression of our economic interests as a country and of our values as a country on issues like the treatment of the Uyghur population, on issues related to Hong Kong or Tibet. As I said, I think, and I think most of our allies thought at the time the current government was a little offside on these issues. We were trying to course correct the country. It was not intended to be anti anything. It was intended to be a reflection of what our foreign policy should be.
So I'll take you to that now. It's EOT 12, and this is the 2021 platform. And so I'll just take you to page 54 of this document. If we go down. Okay, so under number 4 there, you can see standing up to China's aggression. And there's a section there on China. And it's been reported, and I have confirmed that there's 31 mentions of China in this platform. I'm sure you've heard this reported before.
Yeah, how the Western world addresses the rise of China, the positives and negatives from that is the foreign policy challenge of our day, so it was quite comprehensive. But you do notice right at the beginning we say our quarrel is not with the people of China, and we talked about the incredible contributions China has made to the world. We always tried to make sure that that was part of our narrative so that people could see our concerns were interest and values based, not anti anything. It was an expression of what we think we should be as a country.
So when it says China's aggression there, what were you referencing? What was the platform referencing?
Well, certainly treatment of minorities in China is a very concerning aggression towards religious groups, and we list most of them there, or groups like Hong Kongers. Conduct in the South China Sea as well. There's lots of tensions there, the Taiwan Strait. We thought that particularly during the pandemic, when Taiwan was giving us N95 masks and other things, we have to have strong relations with Taiwan, recognizing their democratic rights and have a mature approach to that relationship, which is hard when China was being quite aggressive with respect to Taiwan.
So given the emphasis that appears to be in the platform and the other issues that you mentioned with respect to the motion for the Uyghur genocide and the foreign registry, what is your response to the suggestion that, perhaps the Conservatives lost in ridings with high concentration of Chinese Canadians, not because of foreign interference, but because of the platform and how that position with respect to China may have been viewed in those communities?
Well, many of these positions were positions that we'd previously had. The support for Hong Kong, conservative MPs had been meeting and advocating for Falun Gong practitioners and Tibetans going back to my time in the Harper government. So some of these policies were almost a reassertion of our foreign policy from the Harper government era, and we won those impacted seats quite handily, even in 2015 when Alice Wong held on to her seat. So particularly waves of immigration from China that were Hong Kongers or were folks that were seeking religious freedom and things like this, there was a recognition that it was positive to have concerns with some of the positions of Communist China. And that had never been a problem until more recent years. And I think there's been a bit more of an aggressive foreign policy approach taken by China. It's also why I think this inquiry is so important, because it is hard to determine how much foreign interference will impact one person's voter intent. If one person is intimidated in this country with respect to exercising their democratic rights, that is concerning. The results of the election itself and how many seats are in the House of Commons, that's very important as well, but we shouldn't look past ridings that could be impacted. And I think in recent years, there's been a ramping up of foreign interference operations. And that's why I think, I don't think some of those seats were turned because we had a more traditional or a more aggressive foreign policy posture with respect to China. I think a lot of people did not vote because they were intimidated.
So you believe then, just to kind of summarize, that this was not, the ridings that were lost in those areas where the modeling was off was not due to some grassroots kind of Chinese community distaste perhaps for the platform. It was instances of foreign interference perpetrated by the PRC.
I think that's a fair summary. And my position prior to being leader was the shadow minister for foreign affairs. So I had been talking about many of these policies for many years, several years before I became leader, and there had never been a groundswell of concern. In fact, in many cases, the Chinese Canadian community wanted to make sure that the plight of the Uyghurs, or Hong Kong, or other things were highlighted. And Kenny Chiu, a very prominent voice on these issues, was elected for the first time in 2019. So I think that's how I form my opinion on this, that the foreign interference was much more determinative than a policy platform that had 30 references to China in it.
So I'll take you now to some of the documents we now have on the government side on some of these issues. CAN 5824. And so this is dated September 13, 2021, so it'd be a week before the election. It's a site threat assessment. It's called Site Task Force Update on Foreign Interference Threats to Canadian Democratic Institutions, 2021. So under the section Information Environment, it says there, RRM Canada has observed what may be a Chinese Communist Party information operation that aims to discourage voters from voting for the Conservative Party of Canada. And I understand you've now had a chance to see this document. You did not see it at the time, is my understanding.
No.
Were you made aware at the time, so this is again to situate us in time a week before the election, that RRM Canada, which is the Rapid Response Mechanism Canada, had made this observation?
No, this was not raised to our attention. And in fact, we were raising instances of foreign interference that we witnessed, and the site committee tended to downplay them. And we were given the impression that there were no concerns about foreign interference, which is why these documents now contradict that.
And so when you say tended to downplay them, what do you mean by that?
Well, I appointed one of my most trusted and accomplished friends to be my designate, Mr. Solomon. And when he was briefed at the outset, after having gotten a security clearance to participate in the task force work, he said it started off with a briefing that there were no real problems from 2019 and they didn't expect any serious problems in 21, was how that task force started. We were kind of lulled into a sense of complacency that everything should be fine. There were no problems in 2019. We now know that not to be the case. We now know from the Globe and Mail reporting and Sam Cooper that there were issues in 2019 of financing and other things. So our impression is that the site process was not as complete, not as professional, and not as transparent as it should have been when there were reports like this and CSIS generated intelligence warning of attempts to interfere.
So I'm going to turn now to one of the RRM Canada daily briefs for the period of time during the campaign. It's at CAN 124. And thank you, that's good. And if you look at where it says scan performed, scan covers rather, it looks like it covers the time period between September 10 and September 12, 2021. So about 10 days before the election. And the last bullet point there, a Global Times WeChat article that suggested that CPC almost wants to break diplomatic relations with China is now being actively shared among Canadian WeChat news accounts. The Canadian versions resemble the Global Times article in format and tone and question whether Canadians of Chinese heritage should vote for the CPC. So again, this is talking about a Global Times article that seems to be spreading some misinformation about the CPC campaign. Did you see this article that's being referenced here at the time?
I did not see the article at the time, no.
And did anybody bring this article to your attention? Did anybody say, you know, this is what we're, and when I say anyone, I mean someone in an official capacity, not from within your campaign, but from within a government agency or department?
No one from a government agency or department, no.
And was this emblematic of the things that you were hearing on the ground in terms of misinformation in certain areas?
Yes. Anecdotally, we heard things on 3 or 4 themes. One, that I was going to sever ties. We were going to cancel the use of WeChat immediately if we formed government. There was one that we were going to require Chinese Canadians to register or limit their travel. There were also many horrific reports about Mr. Chu in particular on a personal level, that he hated his race, and just horrific claims were some of the anecdotal reports we heard both during the campaign and in our assessment afterwards.
Thank you. Now, there are other daily RRMs, and I'm just for the record, I don't need them brought up, just in the interest of time, CAN 126, CAN 130, and CAN 132, and you've seen these, correct?
Yes.
They covered the period from September 13 to September 15, 2021. And they reference different articles from Chinese state media taking an interest in the perceived China policies of the Conservative Party, an embassy spokesperson quoting some CPC-related issues, saying that the political party leaders have made unwarranted attacks on China's human rights, and others. So you've had a chance.
Ms. Rodriguez, can we go back to the document, please? I would like just to see the origin of the document.
Oh, sure. I wasn't going to put those up in the interest of time, but I can.
No, but just the one that we looked to.
That we looked at, 124. So the last bullet point there.
Okay, thank you.
And so the three other dailies also talk about misinformation being circulated in Chinese state media and in Canadian media, Chinese language media. And so my question to you is, you've had a chance to review those. I've put the doc IDs on the record. Was any of that information conveyed to you by any official within the government?
No, it was not.
And did anybody let you know that RRM Canada was flagging or had flagged this kind of online content?
No, we were not informed of that. And around the same times, because these documents are dated, our participant, Mr. Solomon, and my chief of staff, Tasha Michaud, were raising reports we were getting from the field. So from various ridings in British Columbia and in Ontario, these type of reports we were sharing and getting no communication the other way. Clearly, they knew some of the instances we were reporting were actually occurring, but that was never confirmed to us in the campaign.
Okay, and
or after.
And so, to be clear, during the campaign, some candidates and some ridings and some campaign staff saw disinformation circulated on social media regarding the Conservative Party. Is that right? And you specifically as leader as well?
Yes, yes.
And
in some cases, in person, social media, and some cases of in-person advertising and voters intimidation.
Okay, and so those concerns were then raised during the campaign period, so during the writ period, to cite through Mr. Solomon and Ms. Michaud. Is that correct?
That's correct. And as I said, we weren't actively preparing a dossier during the campaign. We did when it concluded because we wanted the cases looked into, but we were reporting anecdotal instances throughout the campaign.
And I understand you were also hearing from certain candidates about issues that they were perceiving during their campaigns. Can you tell us a little bit about who you were hearing concerns from and what those concerns were?
Yes. The one I remember the most is Kenny Chu. The level and volume and tone of the misinformation towards Mr. Chu was horrendous, and he was fearful for his own well-being and that of his family, and it was a personal attack, as I said, of a racially motivated nature, suggesting that he was a race traitor and that the simple thing of a foreign registry was some start of a plan to really hinder the ability for Chinese Canadians to visit family, to remain in touch with family. It was, so we heard, and I heard directly from him during the campaign, a little bit from the campaign of Mr. Bob Soroya in Ontario. And I think that wasn't through Bob, but through one of his campaign workers. But some of our organizers were on WeChat and also saw instances. So we knew it was happening. We just weren't able to get a sense that the site and the government knew it was happening. And there was no desire to put out a public warning about misinformation. And that's what I think needed to happen, because I was informed in the run-up to the campaign that there are 600,000 WeChat account users in British Columbia alone. And these are Canadians that don't watch the evening news and don't read the Globe and Mail or the National Post. So they're getting almost all of their information from channels that cannot be trusted.
So you mentioned right now about wanting to give a warning. Can you expand on that notion?
We wanted a caution, a public notice to voters to be wary of information that they were obtaining from social media, particularly controlled foreign language social media. The site process has a threshold, and was the threshold met for there to be some notice? We believe there was. At times, I thought about making some sort of statement, but I was fearful of that being perceived, or opponents in the campaign using that as some sort of wedge in a narrative that we were being discriminatory. So in my view, the process failed in this case, because I think a notice would have been helpful to Canadians that were being targeted, because these sites with algorithms that are controlled by foreign governments, those are the people that are vulnerable and that are at risk, and that I think were failed by our system.
So to be clear, did you request that a warning be issued, or was it your expectation that one would be issued?
It was our expectation that one would be issued, because it was in the sort of originating documents for the task force itself. It was only afterwards in the Rosenberg report that I saw a discussion that they did not feel the threshold was met. But of course, my views on the Rosenberg report was that it was not a proper report. But it was available to be used if there was evidence of misinformation. We now know there was evidence of misinformation, but there was no caution or no notice, no warning given.
Okay, and you considered doing that yourself. Why didn't you in the end?
I remember the last time I was in British Columbia during the campaign, I thought about it, because I was hearing from some of our organizers saying, we've got to do something about this. This is out of control. I heard from Kenny and his team just how targeted and how everyone was tense. Like, people were fearful with the amount of misinformation in the Richmond seats. But we were doing well at that point in the campaign. And so, you're consciously, they say in politics, don't get off message. And so I would have thought that might have seemed a little bit off message. And it might have contributed if I started talking about foreign interference from China, the portrayals of me being obsessed with China and mentioning it 31 times in the platform, these sort of narratives, I might have been accidentally reinforcing that, which is why I think some of these safeguards for our system need to be out of the hands of politicians who are in the midst of a campaign. We need structural and professional and independent and impartial organizations to determine safeguards to protect people's franchise.
So I'll take you to a document, CAN 3781. So this is a security and intelligence threats to election task force summary. It's dated December 17, 2021. And so this is now some months after the election. And if we go to the summary of key observations at the bottom there, the first bullet, sorry, just up a bit more. Thank you. It says the People's Republic of China sought to clandestinely and deceptively influence Canada's 2021 federal election. So just to stop you there, was this something that after the election was conveyed to you?
No.
And the next bullet point says, Site Task Force also observed online media activities aimed at discouraging Canadians, particularly of Chinese heritage, from supporting the Conservative Party of Canada, party leader Erin O'Toole, and particularly former Stevenson Richmond East candidate Kenny Chiu in GE 44. And then it goes on to say that they have observed indicators of potential coordination between various Canada-based Chinese language news outlets, as well as PRC and CPP news outlets. So again, was this ever confirmed to you, relayed to you at any time during your time as leader, which was until February of 2022?
No. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, we were always, these issues were always downplayed, essentially, when we raised them with the site task force. And, these conclusions so quickly after the election show that some people within intelligence and within government knew what we were raising were valid and real issues, and shows why we're here today.
Right. And so if I understand your evidence earlier, you believe, or it's your understanding, that the party lost some seats in 2021 due to foreign interference. Is that right?
It's my view that
Yes.
a certain number of seats were lost, yes.
But it is not your view that the election was lost by the Conservative Party due to foreign interference. Is that fair?
That is fair, and I've always stated that as well.
Okay. And so what impact, if any, do you consider that foreign interference had with respect to your ouster as leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, the small number of seats would not have impacted the minority government that Canada has right now. But the difference of 2, 3, 5 seats may have allowed me more of a moral justification to remain as leader. There were other forces at play that may not have done that. But when I fell 2 seats below the threshold met in 2019, that became a very compelling narrative. And in fact, a petition was started within a day and a half of the election results. And the lower result than 2019 was raised, as was the turning away of Chinese Canadian voters from me were raised as reasons for launching the petition to force my removal as leader.
Is there anything you would have done differently in 2021, either as leader or as a candidate, if you knew then what you know now?
I wish I could have a do-over. What I certainly would have done is made sure that we had a much more sophisticated approach to WeChat in particular, but Mandarin and Cantonese advertising publications and campaign workers to counter what was a deluge of misinformation against us. We were just not prepared on that platform, period. Our social media strategies and our policy development was all still primarily focused at traditional media and what you might call Silicon Valley platforms like Facebook and Twitter and things like this. we did not have the capacity to really even understand what was going on WeChat and some of the other, and I would have prepared in a very significant way had we known. The other thing, I probably would have demanded a public warning of some sort. Now that I've seen both the reporting that in many ways led to this inquiry, but even some of the limited disclosures here, folks within the government knew that there was a level of foreign interference occurring. And I think we owe it to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Canadians that it was targeted at. We owed it to them to warn them and to perhaps give them alternative sources for unbiased news or the ability to report instances of intimidation. This is, one vote matters in our democracy, and I think we have to do a little bit more, particularly for the Chinese Canadian population, but also some other diaspora organizations to make sure that they're not being intimidated to exercise their full rights here.
Now, you have said, and you've expressed the view that there was a failure of CITE to meaningfully consider the evidence of foreign interference that your party brought forward during the election and after the election. Can you expand on that?
Yes. The reporting, particularly from the Globe and Mail, that revealed the financial and the problems in the 2019 election, in my view, that should have been the starting point for the 2021 CITE task force and our participation in it, to say there were some problems of foreign interference in the last election, therefore we have to do even more to safeguard our parliamentary democracy this time. Actually, the opposite happened. Our CITE task force and my participants in it were given a sense that everything was fine, that there were no significant problems from 2019, and that we were very confident in the fact that there would be minimal to no foreign interference in the 2021 election. And as I said, as we were raising issues, driving towards the need for public notice and a caution of some, our concerns were always downplayed by the task force. And, Mr. Solomon has been on the record with having that concern. I have that concern. Even in the days after the election, we continued to work with the CITE task force and with the public safety and intelligence officials on it. And we kept doing that right up until Mr. Trudeau formed his cabinet and the caretaker period ended, and then we were just cut off.
So I'll take you to a CAN 6739. And just to pick up on that notion that it was not just during the election, but afterwards. If we go to the bottom of the page, so it looks like it's an email from Tasha Michaud, and it's dated September 30th, 2021. So this would be about a week after the election, or 10 days rather. As promised, I've attached a document that outlines some key concerns and includes a Dropbox link to screenshots from WeChat. And it looks like she sends it there to somebody with a PCO email address. And if we go up, so we have some individuals there, I believe members of CITE. Howdy, CITE friends. Just received the attach from CPC claiming it shows FI, foreign interference, by PRC in 9 ridings during the election. As you know, we have been engaged by CPC in an ongoing dialogue around these issues. If you could take a look and let Blank and me know if there is anything in here, it would be appreciated. And so this is what you were referring to, that after the election, more information was provided to CITE. Did you receive a formal response to this submission that was done by Ms. Michaud on September 30th? A letter, some sort of concluding report or anything of that nature?
No, we did not. It was generally a one-way communication. And as I said, we prepared this impromptu dossier the last few weeks of the campaign. I asked that we share that with with the site process, even after we lost, to make sure that we could look into these things to safeguard our system.
And I will conclude with an opportunity to see if there's anything else that we have not covered today that you would like to tell us about the issues that we've been discussing, foreign interference in the 2019 or 2021 elections.
I think my witness statement goes into a few of the other experiences and perspectives I have from my time in public life. The one thing I would just add at the end is we did not raise any of this on election night or in the weeks after, because our democratic result was clear. And it was more important to me to safeguard our institutions and our democracy rather than to express disappointment in the loss of a few seats. But as I said, I've seen enough to know that the process last time failed and failed a lot of Canadians. And so I really hope that we look to safeguard these institutions in a nonpartisan way. And I really hope this inquiry can do that, because I think this problem will only get worse. And so we have to create the tools to really have a robust system that values every single voter.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Those are my questions for you. Thank you, Commissioner.
I have one question for you, Mr. O'Toole. Am I right in understanding that actually all the discussion that took place between any of your team members about foreign interference were with site, and no discussion took place with CSIS or with the panel of 5 or with any other agencies, or it was always with site and only with site?
I believe so, yes. My challenge here is I had designates. I had 2 designates for the site process, Mr. Solomon and Ms. Michaud, who would then report to me, and I would share things I was hearing. I believe the site panel and task force did have a designate from CSIS involved. And I do believe from time to time some of the group of 5 may have been involved, but I don't know how frequently. And I know that most of the calls and the meetings were done with a group, and so you'd have to ask.
Okay, but it would have been through site?
Through site, yeah.
Okay, and you were not provided with any names or phone numbers or agency that you may call upon if you were encountering any foreign interference problems, or nothing of that sort?
No.
Thank you. So we'll start the cross-examinations. The first one on the list today, let me see, is I think it's counsel for Michael Chung. Am I right? Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. Morning, Mr. O'Toole.
Morning.
You expressed the view in your testimony this morning that you fear a lot of people didn't vote in the 2021 election because they felt intimidated. In evidence yesterday, the National Director of the Liberal Party, Mr. Ishmael, addressed that point in response to a question from Counsel for the Human Rights Coalition, one of the parties to these proceedings. Her question was specifically around coercion of international students. And Mr. Ishmael expressed the view, I think I'm being fair to him, that that was not an urgent concern because of the secrecy of the ballot. He emphasized ballot secrecy. And I take it from your evidence that you don't share Mr. Ishmael's confidence that ballot secrecy is enough to encourage people to go to the polls without fear of foreign coercion. Would you just tell the Commissioner what your thoughts are about to what extent does the secrecy of the ballot in this country give us some reason to feel confident that foreign coercion of diaspora communities isn't going to be a problem here?
It's a very good question, and something that I think needs to be well understood by the inquiry. How someone votes is completely secret. And thank goodness for that. That's an essential element of our democratic right to vote. But whether you did vote in an election is publicly available. And so the political parties know whether a household has voted in all of the last 4 general elections federally or in none of them. So sometimes extra door knocking, extra literature can be directed towards people that they know vote. And so if you don't know if they're leaning your way or leaning to the other team's way, you may not spend the extra time to try and communicate with that voter. But if you know that they're a constant, always voting, parties spend time on them. That fact that whether you voted or not, I believe, is something that has caused some concerns within diaspora communities, particularly the Chinese Canadian community, because I heard anecdotal reports from some of our MPs that lost that voters said, I didn't think you needed my vote. I thought you were fine. I'm sorry I didn't get out to vote. And in some cases, they were told that people didn't want to be seen on the voters list if that riding stayed conservative. If people had family in China, business or economic interests that depended on favorable treatment, you know, I'm not sure how much that factored into how many people's decision, but some voters, from what I've been told, thought it was best to just not vote. That way, if the riding stayed conservative, no one could suggest that they were a part of voting for the conservative. So there's this fact that it is well known if people vote or not, I don't think is well understood, because the secrecy is what everyone knows about voting, but the secrecy is just who you mark the X by. It's not whether you showed up or not.
Thank you. Also, in your statement, and I think you repeated it in your oral evidence this morning, you expressed concerns that the site, but also the critical election interference public protocol, sometimes known as the Panel of Five, failed in their duty to inform and warn Canadians. I anticipate that later in these proceedings, the Commission will hear evidence of a meeting of the panel on the 9th of September 2019, where the panel decided that in its future deliberations, it would assess potential interference activities for their impact on a single national election as opposed to potential impacts on 338 individual elections across the country. There will be evidence before this Commission that the panel decided to approach foreign interference as a national matter rather than as a riding by riding basis. Would you tell the Commissioner what you think of that approach to assessing whether there's been foreign interference in elections?
Yeah, I think that was an improper decision to make because it doesn't recognize our first past the post system where the general election is 338 individual elections. And our system is structured to support that, and that the composition of the House of Commons is separate from the election itself. And what I think their decision did was discounted some ridings in the Lower Mainland and in the GTA as rounding error ridings. And I think that's unfair to those voters. And to suggest that an election is free and fair from foreign interference is not accurate if some people are impacted. Whether or not it flipped the result in a riding or in a few ridings, each vote matters. So I do think that was a decision that was incorrect to make. I also think it doesn't reflect our history as a parliamentary democracy, first past the post system, with its pros and cons. They should have taken the approach that if they knew several ridings were being heavily targeted, that was sufficient under the protocol to have a public notice and warning. You could have constrained it to media in the lower mainland of British Columbia or GTA, or, there was a lot of ways to actually address this in a way that wasn't making it seem like the entire election and all ridings were at risk. But I think targeted warnings and messaging, particularly in Mandarin and Cantonese, and in the case of 2021, was warranted, and it was a mistake to not raise the alarm.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next one is Council for the Sikh Coalition. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Commissioner. Again, for the record, it's Prabjot Singh as counsel for the Sikh Coalition. Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I just have a few questions for you. Based on the testimony you've given so far, it sounds like your experience in terms of understanding foreign interference was mostly after the fact. After the elections is when the briefings happened, and you were informed about potential targeting of yourself and your party. Is that correct?
About how the targeting was done, yes. The fact that, there was the risk and potential of it, I was aware of for several years before becoming leader.
Okay. And it's your understanding that you may have been targeted specifically because of the Conservative Party platform and positions taken around China and some of the messaging around that position, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall the first time that you first heard about the threat of Indian foreign interference in Canadian elections?
It has been a live issue. I'm trying to think of the first time was probably in relation to the Prime Minister's state visit to India. I was the Foreign Affairs Shadow Minister for the Conservatives at the time. There was a lot of discussion on how we needed to prosecute his trip in the House of Commons, and there was debate on the issues where foreign interference and electoral, and even in the case of Mr. Atwal, who was on the trip and had been convicted in an attack on an Indian politician in Canada. That was the first time I really heard of the subject in the case of the Indian diaspora.
And in that case, was it your understanding that the members of the intelligence community believed that state or non-state actors from India engaged in a disinformation campaign against the Prime Minister at the time?
Yes, that was that was the issue that I wanted to raise following the Prime Minister's trip. The National Security Advisor, Daniel Jean, did side briefings with the media with respect to the Prime Minister's trip and his suggestion to some of the members of the media that the reason the trip had such terrible media coverage was a result of interference by the Indian government. And I took very serious issue with the fact that sounded more like the job of a director of communications and not the job of the national public safety and security advisor to the Prime Minister. I don't feel they should be spinning the media. And, I said that publicly with respect to Mr. Jean. Mr. Scheer at the time, wanted to bring another vote in the House of Commons on a united India, and we didn't raise the Daniel Jean issue. And I think that was a bit of a mistake because it upset many diaspora groups in Canada, that vote. It was, as Foreign Affairs Shadow Minister, it was on my motion that was tabled. Ultimately, the Daniel Jean issue came out and was prosecuted at committee, but that whole issue, I think, was a bit misplayed and caused more tensions within diaspora communities rather than looking at the role of the National Security Advisor and how the Prime Minister approached that state visit, from invitation to prominent Canadians to attend, these sorts of things. So, the intersection of potential foreign interference and diaspora politics in Canada is something that I think this inquiry really needs to dive into, to make sure that regardless of how you came to Canada and where you worship, where you work, you should be able to exercise your franchise free from interference from other states or from coercion in Canada by a group.
I don't want to dwell on this for too long. You earlier gave testimony that's your suggestion that non-partisan bodies should advise about potential foreign interference activity, potentially while it's happening, in order to actually warn communities. But it sounds like you take issue with a public servant at a senior level within the intelligence community providing that kind of live intervention at that time.
Well, Mr. Jean's intervention was based on stopping the bleeding from media stories that were very negative on the Prime Minister. That's not the role of the National Security Advisor. That's the role of a Director of Communications. I do think that the parties, both in the House of Commons and their electoral parties that run nominations and that run general elections, do need linkages directly with our security agencies so that issues can be flagged, like the financing issue from 2019, and so that parties can be aware if there's a security concern of any type before a nomination is completed, before someone gets elected to Parliament, before that potential interference goes right into our Parliament. And so I think how these agencies have the ability to properly, professionally, and discreetly brief the House of Commons and the political parties is something I hope the inquiry provides some recommendations on.
So you provided some evidence about how you believe that China or the PRC targeted yourself because of policy positions your party took, and you didn't learn about these until after the fact. Is it possible that yourself or your caucus may have been targeted for Indian foreign interference because of policy positions that may have aligned with Indian interests, without your knowledge, of course? Is that something that's possible, that could have happened?
It is possible. I will say that when we did table the motion to vote on a united India, and this was, as I said, I wanted to pursue the Daniel Jean aspect of the Prime Minister's trip. That motion and the mere tabling of it upset the Sikh community a great deal. Several hundred of them called my offices in Ottawa and Bowmanville. And so I do know that these issues related to the potential for foreign interference really strike diaspora communities on an emotional level. And so that the parties have to be professional and mature about how they address them, because they can really make a community feel marginalized or unheard. They can be seen to be ignoring obvious attempts to interfere. So this is why I'm saying I think the professionalization both for the House of Commons and our Parliament is separate from the electoral machines of the party. And I think there needs to be a responsible way for both the electoral machines of the parties and the House of Commons to get timely, discrete briefings on intelligence issues, and the hope that all parties will handle it responsibly.
In the lead up to the 2021 election, were you ever made aware of a potential disinformation campaign that targeted your Liberal and NDP counterparts that was mutually amplified by Indian disinformation networks as well as far-right Canadian platforms?
I don't know of any specific campaign or any specific evidence. I do know that the farmers' protests in India that occurred, I think, in around 2020, 2021, drew quite a response politically in Canada, and I tried to, raise food security and the issues of farming families in a way that was responsible and wasn't trying to exacerbate tensions. Each of the parties, I think, tried to approach that issue responsibly, but obviously that was because of the farmers' protests were largely in Punjab. It was a natural issue that brought tensions between Sikh and Hindu communities in Canada. And so I have no information on any possible foreign interference, but certainly there was diaspora concerns to approach the issue responsibly. And I tried to do that.
And would it surprise you if in some of these documents that you've mentioned from the site task force that you weren't privy to prior, would it surprise you if there was information that there was coordinated disinformation emanating from India trying to exacerbate potential tensions between communities in Canada?
I don't want to speculate on what may or may not be there, but when I was living at Stornoway in the lockdown of COVID, we couldn't really go out much. I did notice at one point in the farmers' protest period of time, the RCMP put close protection on the High Commissioner from India, who was my next door neighbor. And I know that we only do that with diplomats if there's a perceived threat, and Canada has an obligation to safeguard against threats. But I only saw that tensions were rising. I don't have any knowledge of any information, and I don't want to speculate, but I am trying to share what I did see at the time.
And during the relevant electoral periods, were you ever briefed by security and intelligence on the potential Indian threat to foreign interference?
No.
Had you been adequately briefed by security and intelligence, would that have increased your situational awareness and your ability to more carefully take precautions for yourself and understand the possibilities of disinformation, the impacts on communities?
I do think these briefings should take place, and I've said, and I said this to CSIS when I received my briefing, particularly now that Parliament has a permanent hybrid quality to it. I think each MP should have more secure means of having virtual offices, whether it's VPNs or I think we need a far more sophisticated approach to signals and communications intelligence for parliamentarians and more knowledge. Electors trust them to go to Parliament to represent their issues. We need to trust them to be able to weigh information, knowing that intelligence is not evidence, but it's an indication that should help form smart decision-making. I think we need to trust our parliamentarians more. That's why structures to allow for more of an interface with intelligence services where needed is I think, prudent and important.
And so,
Mr. Singh, you already exhausted your time, so I would ask you to conclude. You may ask the last question.
This is my final question. So in terms of your suggestion or your observation and based on your experience, what you would like to see is more timely, non-partisan briefings and information from the security and intelligence community to be able to inform the decisions of members of parliament. Is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Commissioner.
Mr. Sirois, counsel for the RCDA.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole, Madame la Commissaire.
Morning.
I'm Guillaume Sirois, counsel for the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. I'm going to ask you some questions regarding Russian interference specifically. In your witness summary, you say that in the final days leading up to the 2021 election, the CPC saw its projected seat count drop. And you attribute much of this drop to the COVID-19 issue, but also to the gains by the People's Party of Canada. Is that right?
Yes.
And why would gains by the PPC cause a drop in projected seats for the CPC?
Our experience in the campaign and in our assessments afterwards was the seat makeup of the House. So we maintained a slight win in the popular vote, but the seat makeup changed dramatically due largely to the vaccine mandate issue. That issue caused several repercussions for us. In the final 10 days of the campaign, the vaccine mandates provincially came into force in Ontario. Premier Kenney in Alberta changed his view on vaccine mandates when hospital ICUs were filling up. And what that did was two things. My position was I was very pro-vaccine. I was not in favor of a mandate that would lead to people losing their jobs or their ability to travel. The splits that emerged where the PPC vote went up for people that were, I might describe as vaccine hesitant or anti-vax. But the soft suburban vote in Ontario, some of the vote that was going to vote NDP went to the government and to the Liberals in the final days. So we lost in part because some of our vote bled off to the right, and some of the centrist vote that we were getting midway through the campaign was lost on the vaccine issue in the final week. There's a range of factors, but that's largely why the dispersion of our votes was not sufficient to win the seat count.
Okay, so you attribute most of this loss of seat to the PPC due to the COVID-19 stance during the election. But in your summary also, I saw that 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 voters for the PPC would have voted for the CPC. Is it something that you'd agree? Is there like...
Yes, the PPC vote was a live issue. I never mentioned Mr. Bernier at all in the campaign. I am very disappointed in his conduct since leaving our party. But in the final week, I did make an appeal in the last few days to PPC voters that if they wanted to see the Liberal government replaced, we were the vehicle, and that a vote for the PPC was actually indirectly helping Mr. Trudeau. That was as far as I would go to appeal to ardent PPC supporters. But why I say it was a real issue is most of the provinces, as I said, were the ones imposing restrictions, and the restrictions and vaccine mandates really caused that vote to go from 2% to 6-7%. In some parts of southwestern Ontario, the vote went into double digits. In some cases, we still held on to those seats in Leamington and places like that. But in a lot of more suburban, ex-urban centers, that split was enough for us to lose. So our modeling showed on Friday I was winning the seat count, and on Monday I lost the seat count. It was a tough weekend.
Understood. Thank you. I will now show you 3 reports from the Rapid Response Mechanism of Canada, also known as the RRM Canada. The first of which will be CAN 000125. And for the benefit of the public, while the document is being pulled, RRM Canada was responsible for monitoring the digital information environment for foreign state-sponsored disinformation during the 2021 election. So this document is report number 3. So the RRM Canada weekly trend analysis for the week of September 2 to 8. I would like to go to the second page, please. The first full paragraph there under the 2 bullet points. I will read some excerpts from that paragraph. Yonder monitoring identified accounts that may be associated with Russian state-sponsored actors who, on a very small scale, have amplified content supportive of accounts of 2 candidates of the People's Party of Canada. RRM notes that both PPC posts involved anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown content. Is this the first time you are hearing about this?
Yes.
More generally, have you witnessed amplification of PPC-related content by a foreign state during the 2021 election before today?
Yes, there was always a fear that some of the troll farms and some of the Russian influence was boosting some of the messages from the PPC, both on anti-LGBTQ type messaging, for example. But certainly when COVID happened, the restriction/vaccine issue, I believe, was amplified by those channels. But I wasn't aware of any of the tracking of it.
Okay. So I understand correctly your statement that it was not only just PPC-related content, but also anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown that you heard before today that was being amplified by Russia.
Yes.
Okay. I will go now to CAN 000134, which is the subsequent weekly report from RRM Canada for the September 9 to 15 period. As you can see from the first page, this is the report for the week of September 9 to 15. I would like to go to the second page again, please. It's the same kind of paragraph, similar information. I will read again some excerpts from that paragraph. The firm, being the Yonder firm that we discussed, which I assume is a firm that the government contracted to conduct those analyses. The firm has seen less engagement from accounts that generally amplify Chinese state sources, but more engagement from accounts that generally amplify Russian state sources. In general, Yonder reports that Chinese and China state-aligned accounts amplify messages by or are supportive of the LPC, while Russia-friendly accounts amplify People's Party of Canada related content. So according to this report, it's a bit like you said at the beginning of your testimony with me today. You have votes are being dragged on both sides. So China is supporting the Liberals and Russia is supporting the PPC. None of this helps the Conservatives, right?
Well, this is the first time I've seen this document, but that was our impression from the field, that the lockdown and the vaccine issue had us support bleeding center right, and you know, I do think that the Chinese FI has been more localized and targeted, but it did affect some seats as well. This is talking about a broader support of the Liberal Party. The gain the Liberal Party had in the final week, our tracking showed came a little bit at the expense of the NDP and less us, but a little bit to us. At the end of the day, it was close until the end, and these splits, you know, are why I'm in the private sector largely now and not in Parliament. But it was a tough campaign. That's why I still believe we shouldn't have had one in the confines of a vaccine over health-related and restrictions and things that were necessary, but were going to be challenging in a civil society.
And the report says that the amplification from Russia increased during the period of September 9 to September 15. Could you clarify if this time frame aligns with the period during which the Conservative Party experienced a decline in projected seats in the final stages of the election?
I can't say on a day-to-day basis where we were. We had a surge early in the campaign. Early in the campaign, COVID was less of a concern. There was slight opening up. You know, there was the ability for the first time to publicly gather on limited bases, so people weren't worried as much about the measures and restrictions. Later on in the campaign, it coincided with the early part of what was the Delta wave. There were pressures on the Alberta hospital system. A few provincial vaccine mandates came into force, like in Ontario and New Brunswick. So the second part of the campaign was much more COVID-centric, which is when we lost our momentum. I can't track it on a daily basis, but that's generally how we saw it happening.
I understand, but does that generally align September 9 to September 15, where September 15 is approximately 1 week before the election?
That's when our momentum stopped, and there were a range of other issues that we had, the gun issue and some other issues that were issues in the media, issues with some of our opponents, but generally it's the same time frame.
And so you said there was a bunch of issues during that time period, but just I want to make sure I understand properly. One of the important issues was the anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown content.
That was the most important issue.
Okay, thank you. And I want to, just for the record, pull the last report from the RRM on that point. It's CAN 000141. This one was issued after the election. It's for the period of September 16 to 23. Again, I'm going to go to the second page, the same paragraph. That starts with yonder again. So, this paragraph reads in part, in general, yonder reports that Chinese and China state-aligned accounts continue to amplify messages by or supportive of the LPC, while Russia-friendly accounts continue to amplify People's Party of Canada related content. So I believe that means that since at least September 2 to 8 period until after the election, this firm, Yonder, reported that there was a foreign state, or at least Russia-friendly accounts amplifying content related to the People's Party of Canada. Is it information that would have been of interest to you had it been communicated?
Yes, I think this is the type of information that I thought was going to be shared on a kind of a live rolling basis with my designate to the site committee task force, but it was not.
And I want to go briefly on your, so the People's Party of Canada did not win a seat, but as you explained earlier, they did perform quite well during the election. They tripled their vote share from 1.6% to 4.9%. And I want to know if you remember, what was the Conservatives' position regarding Russia during the 2021 election?
Well, I was banned to go to Russia, as was the previous leader, Andrew Scheer. I'm wearing my Ukraine pin today. We were very, very strongly opposed to the Putin regime, going back to Mr. Harper, who probably his most famous comment as prime minister was confronting Vladimir Putin, asking him to get out of Ukraine during the illegal occupation of Crimea. So we were very, very strongly opposed to the Putin regime, as was the Trudeau government, I might add, despite early on there was Minister Dion wanted to warm relations with Russia. Ms. Freeland and other members of that caucus pushed to adopt a very strong position countering Putin's aggression. So there was one area where I think the Liberals and Conservatives were generally on the same page, but we were probably known as the slightly stronger tone against. And Operation Unifier and some of the missions in Latvia and training in Ukraine were all initiatives of the Conservative government. So we opposed the Putin regime and Russia under his control.
And I know, do you remember the PPC's position regarding Russia or foreign policy generally?
I have a lot of concerns of PPC and some of the far-right narratives in the United States, particularly with respect to funding the war in Ukraine, being very influenced by Russian propaganda and social media manipulation. I can't speak to, the degree of it during the 2021 campaign, but it's certainly an issue that I've read about. I've watched it unfold in the United States, where the Republican Party has virtually changed their traditional position, in my view, in part because of some of this influence. I've seen it in Canada as well, and I've spoken out against it. I do think Mr. Bernier tries to harness some of these forces, whether accidentally or whether it's coordinated, I can't speak to.
Mr. Roy, your time is exhausted. So if you have a last question, I'm going to allow the last question, but after that, we'll take the break.
Maybe just one last question. Thank you, Madam Commissioner. And in your witness summary, you say that this site task force and the CIEPP failed. After hearing this evidence today, which I understand is the first time you're hearing about that, do you still hold that same belief?
Yes, absolutely. Clearly, my focus during the campaign in 2021 and post, when we continued to work with the site task force, my concern primarily focused on foreign interference coming from Beijing. I never really gave as much thought to the potential for Russian interference or other forms of interference, but that's what I think is a good thing about the mandate of this inquiry, is it can look broader than just the issue of China. Some of what I'm seeing now in the RRM reporting is equally concerning about Russia.
Thank you. Merci, Madame la Commissaire.
Thank you. So we'll take a 20 minutes break. So we'll come back at 11:35.
Order, please. Alors, s'il vous plaît. The hearing is in recess until 11:45. La séance est en pause. Alors, s'il vous plaît. The sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is now in session. Cette séance de la Commission sur l'ingérence étrangère est maintenant en cours.
So next one is Council for the Human Rights Coalition.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole.
Good morning.
You mentioned this morning that you had a sense that the Conservative Party's stronger positions on China were probably being tracked closely by the Chinese government prior to the 2021 election. You would agree that it's likely these stronger positions, as well as the Conservative Party's support of targeted diaspora communities such as the Falun Gong, Uyghur, and Hong Konger communities in its 2021 platform, support of the Uyghur genocide motion, and advocacy for the Foreign Influence Registry that likely made the party a target of the Chinese government.
Yes, that's correct.
From your perspective, has your treatment by the Chinese government in the 2021 election, as well as the experiences of other politicians and leaders who have supported targeted communities, created an environment in which other politicians, leaders, and parties may feel they cannot take a stance against China without facing consequences?
There is a risk of that chill. People not championing minority rights or human rights because of fear of interference or electoral challenge as a result. So I have more respect for people that do, despite some of those risks.
You mentioned this morning that the CSIS briefing you received in 2023 was helpful for understanding what was happening regarding foreign interference issues, but that you would have appreciated getting the briefing a few years earlier. Based on your interview summary, it's my understanding that you believe that if an intelligence agency develops a credible belief that a party or candidate is the target of foreign interference, then the agency should brief the party or candidate, even if the threat posed by foreign interference is minimal. Is that correct?
Yes, if they have some sort of a risk towards them or their family as a result of their public service and positions they're taking, I think if an agency of the federal government is aware of that, that parliamentarian deserves to be notified and deserves support to make sure that risks are minimized or mitigated.
And would you agree that members of targeted diaspora communities should be similarly briefed in a timely manner when an intelligence agency develops a credible belief that they or their family members are a target of foreign interference?
Yes, I believe they deserve that same right.
Thanks, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. So government?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
My name is Gregory Gimenakis. I'm counsel for the Attorney General of Canada, and I just have some clarification questions. So in your evidence this morning, you stated that the Conservative Party of Canada did not lose the general election in 2021 due to foreign interference activities, but they may have lost somewhere between 6 to 9 seats as a result of foreign interference activities, correct?
That's correct.
And I also heard you to say, sir, that those seats may have also been impacted by other factors, such as the position taken by the party on motions in the House of Commons, possibly an understanding in relation to the party's platform or a misunderstanding in relation to the party's platform, and positions taken in relation to vaccines and vaccine mandate. Is that a fair summary?
All the issues that were germane in the 21 election would have applied to all those voters as well. The modeling and the historic voting patterns of the Chinese Canadian diaspora in particular is what helped formulate my opinion. But I've always said that seat range up to 9 is my opinion based on all these considerations.
Thank you. I want to move to just a couple of questions on information flow, and in particular from the party to the site task force. So this morning, and I'm going to start off with a general question to make sure I understood exactly what you said this morning. I understood you to say that the foreign interference activities that the party was monitoring were raised by your representatives to the site task force during the writ period in the 2021 election. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't use the term monitoring. We were not set up to monitor foreign interference in the 2021 election. What I did say on a few occasions was that we developed an informal dossier and started sharing examples that our field organizers, our candidates, and our party officials were seeing on an ad hoc basis. But the monitoring we thought was being done and was being done by RRM.
That's a very fair point.
What we were doing was sharing kind of anecdotal reports to counter the sort of impression being left by site that there were no issues of concern. We were seeing issues of concern and we were flagging them.
So I'm going to rephrase my question. The point that I'm trying to make is your evidence this morning was that there was sharing of information by the party to the site task force during the period. And would it surprise you to learn that this may not actually have been done by the party during the writ period?
Some of the sharing would have been verbal in meetings that we were seeing cases. Some of the evidentiary record, like photographs of the food mart and things like that, were shared afterwards, yes.
To be fair, I expect that the evidence that will come on Friday by the site task force in 2021 will be that there were concerns shared, but that they were only shared after the writ period and after the election result. And so I want to give you the opportunity to help us if that accords with your recollection, or if you're understanding, you are still confident in your position that some information was shared during the writ period.
Our party was raising instances of what we believed was FI. In terms of evidentiary sharing, that happened after the election. I must specify that I was not directly involved with the task force. My designates were Mr. Solomon and Ms. Michaud. From what I understand, in the tail end of the campaign, we were raising reports from the ground that we were hearing with respect to FI. We formalized those into the dossier after.
Thank you. And I heard you say, just coming back to the point of formalizing those activities into the dossier, and you were taken earlier, we don't need to pull this up, to CAN 6739, which was an email from Ms. Michaud forwarding information to the site task force for consideration. Do you recall that discussion you had with Commission
Yes.
Counsel? And did I understand correctly, sir, you to say that you did not receive a response to that inquiry? And I'm just trying to understand, when you say you, is it you in your personal capacity as leader, or are you suggesting that the party did not receive a response to those inquiries?
I did not receive a response, nor was I offered an opportunity to meet with the task force or the group of five. And I'm assuming that my chief of staff did not either, but she may have. I can't be certain of that.
To be fair, the evidence that will come a little bit later is that there was a verbal briefing given to both Mr. Solomon and Ms. Michaud on October 22nd of 2021 in response to the allegations. Does that date ring a bell?
No, because I think our recollection is that on several occasions when things were said, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister told a parliamentary committee that she had responded to Mr. Solomon when she had not. So I would love to see the evidentiary record, but my own experience was that our communication with the site task force was generally a one-way street. And my concern when you use the term monitoring, our monitoring from the election, we weren't set up to monitor the election for foreign interference, but the site task force was. And the sharing we did with the task force was, again, one way. We didn't get the rapid response mechanism reports. We didn't get what I'm seeing now in real time during the campaign. And I think that's a fundamental failure of the system.
And let me just touch on that point. So your evidence today is that there was a failure in the system because the site task force or the panel of five should have made an announcement during the writ period based on the alleged foreign interference activities that were being shared with them. Is that fair?
That's the protocol, I think, warranted some sort of warning to diaspora communities relying on WeChat, for example, yes. But as I said in my earlier testimony, when my designates in the first meeting regarding the 21 election were told that there were no problems with the 2019 election, and a year after the election I read that there were instances of problems in the 2019 election, in my view, that should have been the starting point for the task force. We knew there were some problems in 2019. We're going to be more vigilant in 21 to make sure that the interference, whether it's significant or not, plays no role in any of the ridings in the country.
And did I understand correctly that as leader of the party, you could have made a public announcement yourself, but after careful consideration, you chose not to make an announcement based on the alleged foreign interference activities that were being brought to your attention?
I did make that decision not to formally say anything because of what I perceived to be negative ramifications of that. I also thought the system was working, and if there was knowledge of the reports we were hearing that the protocol would indicate the need for some sort of warning, looking back, I might have made a different decision if I'd been seeing the RRM reports on a daily basis.
And the question that I have, sir, is when you say there was an alleged failure in the system, when did you formulate that view? Did you formulate that view during the writ period, or did you formulate that view with the benefit of retrospection and further consideration looking back?
In the final week of the campaign, when some of our candidates and volunteers were very worried about the level of foreign interference and some of the narratives on WeChat, including narratives about me, that's when I determined that we were not prepared as a country for the level and the methods of foreign interference. And I'll use an example. I don't believe our agencies have adequate line of sight into WeChat. There are two different platforms of WeChat, one for mainland China and one for the diaspora globally. If you monitor it as a foreign account, you may not get the same algorithmic flow that some other users get. Does CSE, do our intelligence agencies even know what's really happening here? I don't think they do.
So
And what I do know is that a lot of Canadians, hundreds of thousands of Canadians now rely on these channels. TikTok is now included in that. That wasn't as big of concern in 2021. So I think we have to make sure that we're giving our intelligence agencies the resources to properly monitor this. And if we don't have the ability to properly monitor, perhaps there should be some restrictions, as we've been seeing with TikTok.
So I appreciate that my time is coming to an end, and thank you for that answer. I have just one more question, and it's about the public announcement. In hindsight, do you agree that an announcement by yourself as leader might have afforded an opportunity to address the concerns you discussed this morning regarding misinformation, whether it be in the writing of Mr. Chu? Apologies, it's not my phone. Whether it be in the writing of Mr. Chu or in the writings in the Lower Mainland or in the GTA.
I regret that I didn't make a statement, because I do feel Mr. Chu, Mr. Soroy, and a few other candidates were exposed to a level of misinformation that I think was profoundly unfair. I will say this, the Winnipeg lab experience, which I talked about earlier, is how the House of Commons wrapped up before the election. When we were bringing up valid public policy questions about potential espionage, potential partnerships with the Wuhan Virology Institute, the Prime Minister and the government would respond by saying, make sure you're not perpetuating anti-Asian hate or discrimination. It was that inadvertent chill around any conversation of this that led me not to say anything publicly, and why I'm in favor of an inquiry and mechanisms so that these decisions are taken out of the crucible of electoral politics and are administered and delivered by trusted sort of agencies and public officials, so that the politics doesn't, stop or prevent a message from getting to voters. But it is a regret I have that now that I see everything, I didn't err inside of making the message, even if it was going to be construed as our attempts to save the campaign or whatever the political spin might have been. I regret not doing that for those candidates that ended up losing, I feel, because of the level of foreign interference.
Thank you for your time, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you.
See you, madam.
It's now for Mr. O'Toole's counsel. Mr. Jarman.
Mr. O'Toole, I've just got one question. You finished off discussing with my friend the impact, or the chill was one of the reasons you didn't make a statement. Were there any other reasons that factored into your choice not to make a statement with respect to the potential foreign interference?
The strength of our institutions and our democracy is something that's very important to me. And the pandemic put a strain on a lot of public confidence in institutions. And I was very much worried that if we were suggesting some seats were lost, or that our electoral fortunes were being impacted by a foreign actor, that some people in the political realm would suggest I was following the approach of the United States, and that the election was stolen and all these sorts of things. That's why I never mentioned it, period, while I was leader of the party. We worked with the mechanisms. We worked with CITE, worked with Mr. Johnston, and why I'm so hopeful that this inquiry can take a proper look at this, so that it doesn't become politicized and that we can start restoring our trust in some of these institutions. That's part of the reason I was so cautious, but also part of the reason why I'm so hopeful that this inquiry really makes some strong recommendations on how we can safeguard things going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Any re-examination, Maitre Rodriguez?
Just very briefly. Mr. O'Toole, I just want to clarify some of the evidence that you gave in cross-examination in response to my friend, the counsel for the Attorney General's questions. I just wanted to understand your evidence. Is it your evidence that you passed on concerns about what you were seeing on the ground during the writ period to your site designates? Is that accurate?
There was, as we were seeing instances and hearing reports on the ground from the campaign, kind of our central campaign team was talking about it. Myself, my chief of staff, the national campaign manager, and the national campaign chair, Mr. Solomon, was also my site designate, as was Ms. Michaud. So it was these discussions that I believe Mr. Solomon took to the task force meetings. I was very proud of the professionalism and approach of our team, so I had full trust that they would raise these issues as the site process went on. The dossier we talked about was after the campaign. We still had a window when the government was still in caretaker mode where we were wanting them to look at things that I don't think they looked at during the writ. We never mentioned publicly that this was going on, but that was still being conducted by largely those four people, with data people and modeling people providing input as well.
Did you ask either one of them to pass on those concerns to site, or was it simply your expectation that they would do so?
It was my expectation from the commentary and what we were hearing and discussing on the ground.
And did you receive any information from them that they had, in fact, passed information on to site during that time?
It was only after the fact, after I was leader, when some of the media reports were coming out in the Globe and Mail, that I said we were flagging these issues, and was told, yes, we had been.
And so to your knowledge, though, were those concerns in fact passed on to site?
I certainly know when we prepared the dossier, we provided evidence of the WeChat, evidence of some of the other instances of foreign interference, but I don't know which ones were communicated verbally during the writ itself. That'd be a question for Mr. Sullivan.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just, I have one question for you. Can you tell me if, at the best of your knowledge, for sure, the terms of the critical election incident public protocol were discussed with the various political parties before they be drafted and implemented?
No, not with me. They may have been in 2019, but I wasn't part of that election team. But there was no discussion of the protocol when I was leader.
Okay. And have you been consulted, when I say you, I mean your party, have been consulted about the composition of the panel of 5?
No, we were not.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And you're free to go or to stay if you wish.
Thank you very much.